You know, there are moments in your life when you realize just how spectacularly wrong you can be about something. This was one of those moments. And by the void's frozen heart, was I about to learn that lesson the hard way. My name is Crix9, and I'm what you might call a xenobiologist. Though after today, I'm starting to think former xenobiologist might be more accurate. I serve aboard the Galactic Council research vessel, Time's Infinite Curiosity *, and our mission was simple enough. Catalog a newly discovered species on some backwater planet called Earth. Simple, I muttered, adjusting my bioscanner for the third time in 10 minutes. They said it would be simple. The briefing had been laughably brief. The target species called themselves humans. Bipedal, mammalian, recently achieved faster-than-light communication, but not travel. Basically, your average primitive civilization that had just learned to send radio waves beyond their solar system, the kind of species we catalog twice a week before breakfast. Our ship's commander, a pompous Zeltarian named Vorth Prime, had literally yawned during the mission overview. Standard procedure, people. Land, observe, catalog, leave. Try not to step on any of the locals. Ha! If only it had been that easy. The landing party consisted of myself, our security chief, Gorth7, a massive Bruthan who could probably bench press a small shuttle, our diplomatic liaison Senna, a Kristan with the personality of wet concrete, and our pilot Jax2, who spent more time polishing his scales than actually flying. We materialized in what our sensors indicated was a human gathering place, some sort of recreational facility with loud music, flashing lights, and the distinct smell of fermented grain alcohol. A nightclub, according to our cultural database. Perfect, Senna 4 said, her crystalline features reflecting the strobing lights. We can observe their social behaviors in their natural habitat. The humans were exactly as described in our files. Bipedal, approximately 1.7 meters tall on average, with that peculiar habit of covering their natural skin with various fabrics. They moved in groups, engaging in what appeared to be ritualistic body movements synchronized to auditory stimulation. Dancing? I noted, speaking into my recorder. The species appears to engage in coordinated physical expression as a form of social bonding. That's when we saw her. She was smaller than the average human, maybe 1.6 meters, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress that seemed to shimmer under the club's lights. But what caught my attention wasn't her appearance. It was the way she moved. Every other human in the establishment was, frankly, flailing about like invertebrates having seizures. But this one? She moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost predatory. Her eyes scanned the room constantly, taking in everything, cataloging threats and exits with the efficiency of a trained warrior. Interesting, I murmured. That one displays significantly different behavioral patterns. Gorth7 snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together. They're all the same, Crix. Soft, slow, weak. I could snap any of them in half without even trying. As if the universe itself wanted to test that statement, 3 human males approached the female. They were larger than average specimens, with the kind of build that suggested they spent considerable time engaging in physical exercise. Their behavior immediately set off every alarm bell in my xenobiologist brain. They surrounded her. Not obviously, not in a way that would alert the other humans, but with the calculated precision of pack hunters. The female tensed, her posture shifting subtly into something that looked almost combat-ready. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the music with surprising clarity. "I'm not interested. Please leave me alone." The humans laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, sweetheart," the largest one said, reaching toward her arm. "Don't be like that. We just want to have some fun." "I said don't grab me," she replied, taking a step back. Her voice carried a warning that made the scales on my neck rise, though I couldn't explain why. They laughed again. "And that, dear colleagues, was when I realized our species catalog was about to require some rather significant updates. The female's hand moved so fast that even my enhanced ocular implants had trouble tracking it. One moment, the human male was reaching for her. The next, he was stumbling backward, clutching his wrist, and making sounds of pain that seemed to indicate several small bones had been fractured. "The hell?" one of his companions exclaimed, moving toward her with considerably more aggression. "I warned you," she said, her voice remaining calm, even as her body shifted into a stance I recognized from martial arts documentation. "I said, don't grab me!" The second male swung at her with his fist, a clumsy, telegraphed attack that any competent fighter would have seen coming from orbit. The female ducked under it, pivoted on her heel, and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision. He folded like a bad hand of cards, gasping for air that suddenly seemed very hard to find. "By the void," Jax 2 whispered. "Did she just?" "Yes," I replied, my recorder forgotten as I watched the scene unfold with growing fascination. "Yes, she did." The third male, apparently possessing more brain cells than his companions, started to back away. But the female was already moving, her legs sweeping out in a perfect arc that caught him behind the knees. He went down hard, his head making an unpleasant sound as it connected with the floor. The entire sequence had taken maybe 10 seconds. The music was still playing. The other humans were still dancing. Most of them hadn't even noticed what had happened. But the three males were on the ground, groaning, and the female was, standing over them with an expression of mild annoyance. "I really hate having to repeat myself," she said, adjusting her dress as if nothing had happened. That's when things got interesting. More humans began to notice the commotion. Some moved away, but others moved closer. And not in a helpful way. I counted at least 6 more males, all with the same predatory look as the first 3, all apparently under the impression that the female had simply gotten lucky. "This should be educational," Senna 4 observed with typical Christan detachment. "We should intervene," Gorth 7 said, his massive hand moving toward his weapon. "Prime directive or not, I'm not watching these primitives gang up on one of their own." "Wait," I said, holding up a hand. "Let's see how this plays out." The female had noticed the approaching group as well. Her posture shifted again, becoming looser, more relaxed. To an untrained observer, she might have looked almost casual. But I'd spent enough time studying predator species to recognize the signs. She was preparing for multiple targets. The first of the new arrivals stepped forward, apparently elected as spokesman for the group. "Hey, lady, I think you misunderstood. These guys were just being friendly." "No," she replied, her voice carrying that same warning tone. "They weren't, and neither are you." He laughed. They all laughed. You'd think they would have learned from the example of their predecessors, currently still groaning on the floor. But no. Apparently, the capacity for pattern recognition wasn't this species' strongest trait. "Listen, sweetheart," the spokesman said, taking another step closer. "Why don't you just calm down and—" He never finished the sentence. The female's hand shot out, fingers extended, catching him in the throat with enough force to cut off his words and send him stumbling backward, clutching his neck. And then she smiled. By all the frozen hells, she smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile that apex predators wear, just before they remind you why you should have stayed home that evening. "Anyone else?" she asked, her voice conversational. Apparently, there were 5 more volunteers. What followed was like watching a master class in applied physics, delivered with the kind of efficiency that would have made our military instructors weep with joy. The female moved through the attacking humans like they were standing still, each strike precisely calculated to maximum effect. A palm strike to the nose, delivered with enough force to break cartilage and bring tears to the target's eyes. A knee to the ribs that produced the distinct sound of bone meeting bone and bone losing. A twist of the wrist that sent one attacker spinning into his companion, both going down in a tangle of limbs. The floor, as the humans might say, was becoming rather red. My gods, Jax too breathed. She's not even breathing hard. He was right. The female stood in the center of what could generously be called a battlefield. 8 human males scattered around her in various states of consciousness and disrepair, and she looked like she'd just finished a light warm-up exercise. She checked her reflection in a nearby mirror, smoothed down her hair, and walked to the bar as if nothing had happened. "I'll have a whiskey," she told the bartender, who was staring at her with an expression of mixed terror and admiration. "Neat." The bartender, apparently deciding that serving her was preferable to becoming victim number 9, hastily poured the drink. That's when the real complication arrived. The establishment's security personnel had finally noticed the situation. 3 humans in black uniforms, all substantially larger than the previous attackers, all with the kind of build that suggested they'd been hired specifically for their ability to handle problems like this. They approached the female with considerably more caution than the others had shown, which displayed at least some capacity for learning. But they still approached. "Ma'am," the lead security guard said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm going to need you to come with us." The female took a sip of her whiskey, savored it for a moment, then turned to face him. "Why?" "I was defending myself." "You put 8 people in the hospital. They started it. That's not how this works." She sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "No, I suppose it isn't." The lead guard reached for her arm, apparently not having learned the lesson that 8 of his fellow humans had just received. "I wouldn't," she said quietly. He paused, his hand inches from her shoulder. "I really wouldn't," she repeated. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Throughout the entire previous altercation, the female had been holding back. She'd used enough force to incapacitate her attackers, but not enough to cause permanent damage. She'd been pulling her punches. But now, looking at her face as the security guard's hand hovered near her shoulder, I could see that her patience had run out. "You know what?" she said, finishing her whiskey and setting the glass down with a soft clink. "Fine. You want to do this the hard way? Let's do this the hard way." The security guard's hand completed its motion toward her shoulder. 10 minutes later, the floor was very, very red indeed. "Gorth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as we watched the female calmly walk toward the exit, stepping over the unconscious forms of what had once been the establishment's security team. "Yes, Crix? We need to update our files on this species. What should I put down?" I watched the human female disappear into the night, leaving behind a scene that looked like a small war had been fought and decisively won by a single combatant. "Dangerous," I said finally. "Put down very, very dangerous." But even as I said it, I knew that single word couldn't possibly capture what I'd just witnessed, because what I'd seen wasn't just violence, it was artistry. The female hadn't just defeated her attackers, she'd done so with a level of skill and precision that suggested combat wasn't just something she could do, it was something she was born to do. And if one individual of this species could do that, what could they accomplish if they ever organized themselves for war? I shuddered, a full-body tremor that had nothing to do with the establishment's air conditioning. We were going to need a much bigger report. You know what they say about assumptions? They make you look like an idiot in front of the entire Galactic Council. And right now, standing in the smoking ruins of what used to be my understanding of xenobiology, I was feeling pretty idiotic indeed. "Command, this is Research Team Alpha." I spoke into my communicator, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "We need immediate extraction." "Already, Crix?" Commander Vorth Prime's voice crackled through the device, dripping with typical Zeltarian condescension. "You've barely been planetside for 2 hours. Did you get scared by one of their primitive transportation devices?" I looked at Gorth 7, who was still staring at the nightclub's entrance, with the expression of someone who just watched physics take a holiday. "Sir, we need to talk. In person. Now." Is this about the catalog entry? Just mark them down as Class 7 sentience, with basic tool use, and be done with it. Sir, I said, my voice cracking slightly, I don't think they're Class 7. A pause. Then laughter. Actual laughter from our commanding officer. Don't tell me you've caught a case of primitive sympathy, Crix. These humans barely have space flight. Their weapons are still chemical-based. They haven't even figured out plasma manipulation yet. Sir, I really think we should. Catalog them and move on, researcher. That's an order. The communicator went dead, leaving us standing in the aftermath of what I was increasingly certain would be remembered as the most significant underestimation in galactic history. Well, Jax too said, his voice unusually subdued. That went well. We need more data, I muttered, pulling out my scanner again. There has to be an explanation for what we just witnessed. Semaphor's crystalline head tilted in that maddeningly analytical way her species had perfected. Perhaps that individual was an aberration, an exceptionally trained specimen. Maybe, I said, though something in my gut told me otherwise. Let's find out. We spent the next 3 hours conducting what I generously called field research, and what would more accurately be described as terrified observation from a safe distance. What we found made our nightclub experience look like a gentle introduction to human nature. At a place called a gym, we watched humans voluntarily subject themselves to physical torture that would violate 17 different articles of the Galactic Convention on Sentient Treatment. They lifted metal objects that weighed more than some of my colleagues, ran on mechanical devices until their skin leaked moisture, and seemed to actually enjoy the process. This makes no sense, Gorth 7 rumbled, watching a human female deadlift twice her body weight. Why would a species deliberately weaken itself through exhaustion? They're not weakening, I realized, with growing horror. They're training. At something called a martial arts dojo, we observed humans teaching their young the same combat techniques we'd seen the nightclub female employ. Children, barely past their larval stage, were learning to incapacitate opponents with surgical precision. Educational system includes mandatory combat training, I noted for my recorder. Species appears to prioritize physical conflict resolution from an early age. But the real revelation came when we visited what their databases called a military base. Now, I should clarify something here. When most species develop military forces, they tend to follow predictable patterns, overwhelming numbers, superior technology, or specialized biological advantages. What they don't do is train every single individual to be a one-person army. We watched humans run obstacle courses that would challenge Olympic athletes from a dozen different worlds. We saw them disassemble and reassemble weapons blindfolded. We observed combat drills that assumed each soldier would face multiple opponents simultaneously. And then, we met Sergeant Maria Santos. She was conducting a training exercise for new recruits, teaching them something called hand-to-hand combat. The recruits were large, healthy specimens who looked like they could handle themselves in a fight. Santos was maybe 1.65 meters tall and looked like she weighed about as much as my left arm. "All right, maggots," she called out, and I made a mental note to research this apparent human tendency to address each other using invertebrate terminology. "Who thinks they can take me down?" 6 recruits volunteered. 6 large, confident, well-trained human males who apparently thought they could overpower one smaller female. I checked my chronometer. The entire exercise took 47 seconds. When the dust settled, 6 unconscious recruits were scattered across the training mat, and Santos wasn't even breathing heavily. "Anyone else feel like volunteering?" she asked the remaining group. Nobody volunteered. "That's what I thought," she said, then noticed us watching from the observation area. "Can I help you folks?" My universal translator kicked in as she approached, and I realized with a start that she was addressing us directly. Somehow, she'd spotted 4 camouflaged aliens observing from what we'd thought was a concealed position. We're, exchange students, I managed, falling back on our prepared cover story. From Canada. She gave me a look that suggested she wasn't buying it for a second, but nodded politely. Canada, huh? You folks look a little unusual for Canadians. We're very northern Canadians, Jax 2 added helpfully. Uh-huh. Santos studied us with the kind of attention that made my survival instincts scream warnings. Well, exchange students, what did you think of the demonstration? Impressive, I said, which was possibly the understatement of the millennium. How long have you been training? Started when I was 6, she said casually. Basic stuff at first. Kicks, punches, grappling. Got serious about it in my teens. 6 years old. She'd started learning to kill at 6 years old. Is this normal for your people? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Santos laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both friendly and terrifying. Normal? Buddy, this is basic stuff. You should see what the Special Forces can do. Special Forces. There were humans more dangerous than this. I don't suppose, I said, my scientific curiosity overriding my common sense. You could show us what you mean? Well, Santos said, glancing at her watch, the Rangers are running urban combat drills in an hour, if you want to observe. An hour later, I was beginning to understand why evolution had given me such strong flight reflexes. The urban combat drill involved 12 humans armed with simulated weapons, tasked with clearing a mock city of hostile targets. The targets were other humans, equally well armed and trained, playing the role of enemy combatants. What followed was like watching a live-action tactical manual written by the god of war himself. The Rangers moved through the simulated urban environment like ghosts, communicating through hand signals that spoke of years of coordinated training. They used the terrain to their advantage, turning every corner into a potential ambush point, every rooftop into a sniper's nest. But what really got my attention was their casualty tolerance. When one of them was killed in the prior's simulation, the rest adapted instantly, redistributing responsibilities without missing a beat. When half the team was eliminated by a well-placed explosive, the survivors didn't retreat or call for backup. They regrouped and continued the mission. Acceptable losses, I heard their leader mutter into his radio. Continue with primary objective. Acceptable losses. They factored their own deaths into their tactical calculations. By the void, Gorth 7 whispered beside me. They're not just warriors. They're fanatics. No, I corrected, watching the Rangers complete their mission despite suffering 70% casualties. They're soldiers. There's a difference. After the exercise, I managed to corner the team leader, a human named Captain Jake Morrison. He was tall, scarred, and had the kind of eyes that suggested he'd seen things that would give normal beings nightmares. Captain, I said, can I ask you something? Shoot, he replied, and I made another mental note about human linguistic habits. How many of your species have military training? Morrison considered this for a moment. Active military? Maybe 1% of the population, but most of us have some kind of combat training. Sports, martial arts, self-defense classes. It's pretty common. 1% active military. That meant roughly 70 million human soldiers, if my population estimates were correct, and most of the rest had some combat experience. What about your history? I pressed. Has your species always been so martially inclined? Morrison laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Buddy, we've been fighting wars since we figured out how to pick up sticks. We've fought over food, territory, resources, ideology, religion, and probably a dozen other things I'm forgetting. Hell, we've had 2 global conflicts in the last century alone. Global conflicts. They'd fought wars that spanned their entire planet. The thing is, Morrison continued, we learned something from all that fighting. We learned that if you want peace, you'd better be ready for war. Because there's always someone out there who's willing to take what you have if they think you can't stop them. And can you? I asked. Stop them, I mean? Morrison's smile was the kind that predators wear when discussing prey. We haven't met anyone we couldn't stop yet. That night, back aboard the Times Infinite Curiosity **, I sat in my quarters, trying to compile a report that wouldn't get me committed to a psychiatric facility. How do you tell the Galactic Council that the primitive species they'd sent you to catalog could probably conquer half the galaxy if they put their minds to it? How do you explain that a species that hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel had developed combat techniques that would make Catharian battlemasters weep with envy? How do you warn them that humanity's apparent technological backwardness was the only thing standing between the galaxy and the most dangerous military force it had ever seen? My door chimed, and Gorth 7 entered without waiting for permission. A habit that would normally have annoyed me but now seemed refreshingly normal. "Any luck with the report?" he asked, settling his bulk into a chair that groaned under his weight. "How do you write 'we are so screwed' in official diplomatic language?" I asked. "That bad?" I showed him the preliminary data I'd compiled. Population: 8 billion. Military personnel: roughly 70 million active, with perhaps 10 times that number in reserves and veterans. Combat sports participation: hundreds of millions. Martial arts practitioners: similar numbers. And those were just the ones who fought for sport or profession. The nightclub incident had taught us that apparently normal civilians could be walking weapons. "The thing that really gets me," I said, "is that they don't even realize how dangerous they are. That woman at the club, Sergeant Santos, Captain Morrison, they all acted like this was perfectly normal behavior." "Maybe for them it is," Gorth 7 suggested. "That's what scares me." "Gorth, do you realize what would happen if this species ever developed faster than light travel?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, the galaxy would have a problem." "A problem?" "Gorth, the galaxy would have a new apex predator species. And unlike every other apex predator we've encountered, this one has opposable thumbs, advanced engineering capabilities, and an apparent genetic predisposition toward organized violence." My communicator buzzed. Commander Vorth Prime's voice filled the room. "Research Team Alpha, report to the bridge immediately. We've received new orders from Council Command." We made our way to the bridge, where Vorth Prime was standing before the main display screen with his usual expression of smug satisfaction. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I have excellent news. Council Command has decided to fast-track this primitive world for integration into the galactic community. We're to establish formal contact immediately and begin the process of technological uplift." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "Sir, I really don't think that's a good idea." "Nonsense, Crix. These humans are perfect candidates for rapid development. They're intelligent, organized, and completely harmless. What could go wrong?" Gorth 7 and I exchanged glances. "What could go wrong? How about giving faster-than-light travel to a species that had turned warfare into an art form?" "Sir," I tried again, "if I could just show you our preliminary findings." "Later, researcher. Right now, we have history to make. Senna, prepare the first contact protocols. Jax, set course for their largest population center. We're going to give these charming primitives the gift of galactic civilization." As the Times Infinite Curiosity Times changed course toward what the humans called New York City, I found myself wondering if the galaxy was about to make the biggest mistake in its recorded history. Behind us, on the surface of Earth, 8 billion humans went about their daily lives, completely unaware that they were about to be invited to join a galactic community that had no idea what it was getting itself into. In a few hours, humanity would learn they weren't alone in the universe. In a few days, the universe would learn that humanity was exactly the kind of species you don't want to give starships to. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the memory of that woman's smile as she'd asked, "Anyone else?" The galaxy, I realized with growing dread, was about to find out that there were indeed others, 8 billion others, and they were all human. The universe was about to become a much more interesting and significantly more dangerous a place. God, help us all.